Good afternoon. The Subcommittee on Federal Workforce, Postal Service, and the District of Columbia hearing will now come to order. I'd like to welcome our ranking member, Mr. Chaffetz of Utah, members of the subcommittee, hearing witnesses, and all those in attendance. The purpose of today's hearing is to review recent regulatory changes to hiring, such as shared registers, the upgraded USA Jobs website, and the Veterans Employment Initiative, as well as to consider proposed legislative initiatives. The Chair, the ranking member, and the subcommittee members will each have 5 minutes to make an opening statement, and all members will have 3 days to submit statements for the record. I'd also like to ask unanimous consent that the American Legion statement be submitted for the record. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen, those of us assembled here this afternoon, no matter our political stripes or whether an applicant, union member, manager, or current federal employee, unanimously agree that the federal government's hiring system falls short of the optimum. And since our nation is experiencing numerous and complex challenges that require smart, capable individuals who possess the necessary skills and leadership abilities to ensure our future, it is critically important that the federal government, as an employer, be able to easily recruit and hire qualified candidates. Unfortunately, this has not been the case over the past several years, which is why I have called today's hearing to discuss how best to improve the federal hiring process. The American public expects merit-based hiring for public service jobs, and rightfully so. However, this is easier said than done since enactment of the Pendleton Act, which established the nation's adherence to public notice and competition for federal employment opportunities. Much debate has occurred on this topic, ranging from what assessment tools and standards should be used to evaluate applicants to where positions should be advertised and how candidates should ultimately be selected. Additionally, the federal government has long stood by its commitment to hire individuals with military service. And given the large number of veterans stemming from Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, it is critical that we continue to uphold this pledge. At the same time, scores of college graduates are eager to answer the call of service. It is my hope that working with all of you in this room, we can craft a hiring structure that will fulfill our obligations to our veterans, as well as allow for the advancement of existing employees and the onboarding of recent degree recipients. The federal government, as an employer, must also be engaged in ensuring that a diverse set of individuals are recruited and retained, so that the public servants that are charged with performing the people's business ultimately reflect our nation's society. During a time of high employment, as an employer, the government has a special responsibility to ensure that its citizens are aware of job openings and that the application process is completed as swiftly and as fairly as possible. Thus, I anticipate the testimony and feedback we will receive from today's witnesses will provide the subcommittee an opportunity to assess federal hiring in general, as well as a chance to review recent executive branch hiring programs such as the Veterans Hiring Initiative, the revamped USA Job Site website, and the shared registers, and of course the President's hiring reform memorandum that was issued just last week. I'm glad that the subcommittee is joined by the Office of Personnel Management Director, John Berry, who, as a champion of our federal workforce, has been tenaciously focused on advancing hiring reform for the federal government. Again, I thank each of you for being with us this afternoon, and I look forward to your participation. It is the, I will now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Chaffetz of Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you, Director Berry. I want you to know I sincerely appreciate the cooperative spirit that you bring to working with the subcommittee and with both of our staffs on both sides of the aisle. That is very much appreciated. Thank you for being here today, and the other witnesses that will testify in our second panel as well. I do support the Office of Personnel Management's efforts to streamline and reduce the bureaucratic red tape, the federal recruiting and hiring process. I'm very sympathetic with the idea that it takes 160 days, and trying to reduce that down to 80 days. Even 80 days to me seems like much too long to have to go through the process for fulfilling a position. If suddenly an employee were to leave for whatever reason and there was a gaping hole, it seems like a very long, convoluted process that can certainly be streamlined I'm very sympathetic with those goals and concur with the goals along the way. At the same time, there are a number of concerns with the federal workforce, and I'm sure this won't be easy. The federal government already employs approximately 2.8 million civilian employees and is experiencing a robust expansion at unprecedented levels. Perhaps this discussion is there for another day. When we talk about jobs, I'm more concerned about jobs in the private sector, not the public sector. But nevertheless, given the administration's push for the growth and expansion of government, we're going to have to deal with the fact that we need to hire people at unprecedented rates. I'm concerned about the trend and believe that the hearing presents an opportunity to examine how to maximize the efficiencies of the federal workforce and certainly try to become closer to what is already happening in the private sector. We have the average age of the federal workforce rising. We have retention rates that are much greater than in the private sector because of these high-paying jobs with good benefits. At the same time, we have an aging workforce, and we need to consider hiring practices that can fill the looming gap. Our troubled economy has created a dynamic with more and more people looking for jobs than ever. Prospective employees are no doubt seeking greater stability, higher pay, and attractive benefits that federal employment has to offer. The American public, who on average earn significantly less wages and benefits than federal employees, rightfully demand their money be spent wisely and efficiently, something that cannot be said of the current federal employment system. However, the administration is attempting to address some of these inefficiencies, and I applaud them in those efforts. Last week, the President issued a memorandum intending to improve the recruitment and hiring of federal employees, and I applaud these proposed reforms. I do have some specific questions and things that will need further clarification as we move forward, and hopefully they will all be successfully implemented. Today's hearing allows us to engage in a spirited discussion in the administration's recent memorandum and other initiatives, especially since federal human resource management is one of our key oversight functions. And I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today. I do believe there are some other issues that we'll need to address, although not directly on topic. I think the idea and the notion that current federal employees should be paying their federal taxes and that potential federal employees should be current in paying their federal taxes is an issue that I will not let go of, and I think we need to address it sooner rather than later. Obviously, we have issues with veterans, with the Intern program that I know Congressman Conley and others are working on, Congressman Bilbray from the Republican side of the aisle, and we'll have to explore those ideas as well. But again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Director Berry for being here and the cooperative spirit that he brings to this, and look forward to the hearing. I'll yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
First, Mr. Chairman, I just want to commend, compliment, and thank you for letting no grass grow under your feet after this executive order before calling us right here so that we can get moving on this right away. The complaints don't begin with this administration. They seem to be ad infinitum. And of course, what the President has done raises other questions. I commend the President for as far as he has gone and believe that we can go the rest of the way under your leadership, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
I thank you. It is the committee policy that all witnesses are to be sworn. Could I ask you to please rise? Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to deliver to this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let the record show that the witness has answered in the affirmative. I'll offer a brief introduction, and then we will proceed to questions. Mr. John Berry serves as Director of the United States Office of Personnel Management, which manages the federal government's civil service. Prior to Mr. Berry's appointment, he was the Director of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Director of the Smithsonian Zoological Park. He also served as Assistant Secretary for the Policy, Management, and Budget of the Department of Interior during the Clinton administration. We welcome you, sir, and I recognize you for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Norton and Mr. Chaffetz, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to discuss many of the initiatives that the President put into motion last week and to go into those in greater detail with you. The President issued a memorandum directing agency heads to take specific actions to improve federal recruitment and hiring processes by November 1st of this year. These actions include eliminating requirements that applicants answer long essay-style questions as part of their initial application for a federal job. This requirement has discouraged many applicants qualified to work for the federal government over the years, and I believe their competencies, as the President determined as well, can be assessed in better and less burdensome ways. The President's memorandum allows applicants to use a simple resume and a cover letter as their application for federal employment. Alternatively, agencies may allow applicants to complete a very simple, plainly written application form or a packet. No matter what approach, agencies must use valid and reliable tools to assess applicant qualifications. The President is also directing agencies to use category rating method in selecting candidates rather than the traditional rule of 3. This means selection will not be limited to just 3 candidates alone. Instead, under category rating, applicants are placed into 1 or 2 or more quality categories, and of the candidates in the highest quality category can be considered for selection, and veterans preference and all of the veterans preference rules under the law still apply. Finally, the President's memorandum directs agencies to ensure that supervisors and managers are more involved in the hiring process, which has not been the case, including workforce planning, recruitment, and interviewing. You cannot delegate an interview to an HR manager. The hiring manager is the one who has the experience with what the job requirements are. They need to do that interview and make those determinations. Finally, we've been working with OMB for months to be ready to roll this memorandum out. To that effect, we issued a guidance memo to agencies last week. OPM is deploying mobile assistance teams to allow immediate response to agencies that request them. Many of the larger agencies are already rolling in this regard. We're going to be setting up websites where we can share best practices so that smaller agencies that might be running a little behind can stay in the game by following best practices throughout the government, and we'll be assisting in that regard. I'd like to highlight, if I could, one of the most important issues for the President and my highest priority. In fact, it was the first issue I began to tackle after sworn into this position, and that was increasing our veterans' employment throughout the federal government, especially in the civilian side of the House. I believe the unemployment rates that our men and women returning from the Middle East right now are the highest in history. They're over 28%. They are unacceptable to me, and they are unacceptable to this President. We are fully committed to reversing and lowering those numbers and increasing the number of veterans hired throughout the civilian side of the federal government. To that end, last November, the President issued Executive Order 13518. That order reinforced OPM's partnership with the Department of Defense, Labor, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security, along with all the rest of the government, in promoting the employment of veterans throughout our government. We've made good progress in the first 6 months of that. OPM has issued our strategic plan in that regard that will guide us through 2012. That's available on our website. It focuses on dismantling barriers to veterans' employment by reinvigorating leadership commitment to the employment of veterans, providing employment counseling to veterans and opportunities to develop their skills, creating a marketing campaign to promote veterans hiring throughout the government, and establishing one-stop information gateway for employment information plus resources for veterans, staffed by veterans. The other 2 things we're working on, I'm happy to report, Mr. Chairman, the council that the President's executive order has met twice. We now have standing in place in 26 federal departments full-time veterans hiring officials. That is not collateral duty, as it has been in the past. So we have committed true resources on this. We are building a network so that we can share and match skills of our veterans who are returning with actual jobs in the federal sector. I'm also pleased to report I just returned from New York, where I was very honored to meet with the HR directors for over 200 Fortune 200 companies from the private sector. And I asked them to consider allowing us to extend these opportunities for our veterans, not only in terms of the federal government, but into the private sector as well, and to see if we could develop a system to share resumes that would be legal and appropriate. I have to tell you, I was extremely pleased by the response, and they are working with us in that regard, and we're going to be setting up a model program with both the Veterans Affairs and the Department of Labor I got to tell you, Assistant Secretary for Vet Affairs at Labor, Ray Jefferson, is just one of the best in government, and he's a delight to work with. So I am very pleased. I think we're making great progress on this, and in the year ahead, I think you're going to see those unemployment numbers come down because of it. Finally, I'll wrap up because I know I'm at the end, sir. We are working on overhauling USA Jobs. The next up, the President directed me to report back in 90 days on two last very critical things that are linked into this, is how do we bring students effectively into our government and do that responsibly and effectively, and then finally increasing the diversity within our government, making sure that we have open access for all communities throughout our country, and we are working hard on all of those regards, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to answer any questions that you or the committee might have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Berry. We appreciate that. Here's what I'm concerned about, and I appreciate the work that you're doing on veterans hiring, and I think that's a noble and a correct initiative for this country to take. These folks put on the uniform, men and women. The services they look like the American population as well, and there's the added discipline and experience, patriotism that they've demonstrated. I'm concerned that the non-competitive processes that have evolved would actually diminish the number of veterans that are hired. And we've got right now probably 250,000 men and women in uniform in Iraq and Afghanistan right now. Yep. And as you said, the unemployment rate of these folks coming back is astronomical. That should not be. I've seen from this position as chairman attempts by some agencies to completely circumvent the veterans hiring process, and not just with a few people, but to obtain basically a waiver from hiring veterans, and that concerns me greatly. It seems when you look across government, some agencies do very well, and if you talked about Department of Defense, obviously they do a great job. I've seen great hiring at the post office, in the United States Postal Service. Very aggressive in trying to bring veterans into the workforce. Treasury, not as well. So it's a real hit and miss. We've seen Department of Homeland Security. They've adopted a system that goes completely around the veterans hiring preference, and you would think Homeland Security would be something that our veterans coming out of the service might have an actual strength in. So that's mind-boggling, to say the least. So while I understand we need to fix this system, and I think you've done great work here, getting rid of that essay basis, that sort of anachronism to an earlier time, although I think in some positions strong writing skills are very, very important, but I don't think it should be the threshold inquiry. How do we make sure, how do I know next month, if we adopted this today, how do I know that next month that my veterans are still being hired? How do I know that that by opening the door to some young people coming out of college and who are, extremely well trained and capable, we're not closing the door to some of my veterans, because that just cannot happen.
Mr. Chairman, my personal commitment to you, and that of, I believe I can convey as well, of the President, is that we are, there is no intention to do whatsoever anything that would restrict or reduce our commitment to hiring veterans. And in fact, we want to increase the number of veterans we're hiring across the board. And so we are watching these numbers very carefully on a month-to-month basis. I believe in leading by example. OPM is one of those civilian agencies that we do a good job of hiring veterans. We range between 25 and 30% of our hires, our new hires, are veterans. And now, across the federal government, that ranges. I don't want to imply that implies everywhere. And one of the reasons we pursued the President's executive order last November was some agencies, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, are as low as 5%. Some, like DOD, are at 50%. So, you know, obviously they're doing a fantastic job. The VA does a fantastic job. Homeland Security, sir, actually does a pretty good job. They're in that 15 to 25% category. What we're looking at in the council that the executive orders created, that is chaired by Secretary Solis and Secretary Shinseki, and I'm the vice chair of that council, sir, is we're the first year since we're just getting this up and running in the agencies. The guidance we've given all of the agencies is do better than you did before. Hire more vets than you have done before. Whatever you're doing now, do better. So that's this year's directive and goal. But what we are at our next council meeting, which is going to be in early summer, what is on the agenda to discuss, Mr. Chairman, is actually setting hard target goals that we can look at to hold people accountable in the next fiscal year, where we're giving them adequate warning to prepare. And what we're looking at as an approach that's being discussed is, if you're in that lowest category, if you're in the 5 to 10% hiring, then you've got to do more, and we're going to put a higher burden on your shoulders to catch up. Obviously, if you're at DOD and you're already at 50%, it's kind of hard to go much, you know, to do, you know, they're not going to be able to have that same percentage increase. So we're asking those agencies at the top to hold the line while we bring the ones at the bottom up. And so next year, we're going to have pretty good hard goals, and the next council meeting is going to be discussing this, is to set those specific priorities, Mr. Chairman, so we can hold it accountable. But I can tell you this, back to the first question is, we are watching these numbers on a month-to-month basis, and if they go down, we will immediately react. We are not going to let our veterans suffer under any program that this administration puts in place. And so I'm concerned by some of the issues that you raised and that are in existence. We are going to be working with those agencies to correct them. But the bottom line is we want those numbers to all get better.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear. And in closing, I just say, having spent a lot of time with men and women in uniform, you've got some very, very, very highly trained and very capable people. These are our very best in every aspect of it. So I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Chaffetz of Utah.
Thank you, and thank you again, Director Berry, for being here. My understanding is we have roughly 2.8 million civilian federal employees that we do. Go ahead.
Right now, the number I've got, Mr. Chaffetz, is 2 million.
Okay.
I'm not sure where you're getting the 0.8, that 800,000 from. So we're happy to work with your 2 million.
2 million.
Okay.
And my understanding is that non-postal civilian workforce has increased roughly about 105,000 since the President took office in January. Is that, and again, I know I'm throwing some numbers at you right off the top. If that's not it, help clarify that for us. I want to get the number accurate. In the short range and the long range, how many federal workers are we looking to grow and expand? I mean, we've had this massive health care bill, we've got a lot of other pieces of legislation, we're spending at unprecedented levels. From your vantage point, how many people are we going to be hiring in the federal government, new employees, net increases in the short and long range?
Mr. Chaffetz, the majority of those hires that you talked about, the increases that have been made, my understanding are sort of fall into 3 categories. One is veterans hospitals, where we have been putting in place more nurses and more doctors to handle some of the more severe cases that are returning from the Middle East. And so that's one percentage category. And I will get you these exact numbers in response for the record. Okay. The second 2 major categories are the financial regulation that Treasury has had to put into place to restore stability to our financial markets, has required us to do some additional hiring in the regulatory arena in the financial industry. And then the third category, the third major category, is Department of Homeland Security. So clearly over 80%, 80 to 90% of the increase that you discuss is in those 3 categories in terms of an increase.
Okay, and that's looking back, but looking forward.
Now, looking forward, the one thing I think what the Office of Management and Budget, and we are looking at, this president is not looking to significantly grow the size of government. But one of the things that we need to be aware of... I
disagree with you on that point,
well,
but continue.
I respectfully would argue that point with you. One of the things we need to be aware of, and what has happened over the past 10 years, is there's been a significant increase in the number of contractors by the federal government. And what the Office of Management and Budget has directed agencies to do now is to go through and define what are essential functions that need to be done by government employees.
I appreciate all that. I got to get through some other questions here.
Okay.
Do you have a net number that you're looking towards? You got to have some sort of plans. I mean, you got the president to sign off on an expansion plan, you know, and I appreciate the goals. That some of the testimony in the second panel says at any given time there are 40,000 open jobs on USA jobs.gov or whatever the website address is. How many are you planning for?
Well, Mr. Chapes, you got to understand.
We're not going to have a net decrease in the number of federal employees.
There is no plan for a major increase or run-up of the federal government. Let me just assure you of that. 40,000 is low. Let me tell you, our average spin rate for jobs, out of 2 million people we hire, there's an average between retirements and people moving into other sectors, it's between 200,000 and 300,000 people a year that we are hiring. So on a regular basis. So we're regularly recruiting, but that isn't additional jobs. Those are filling existing jobs.
Undoubtedly,
So,
that's what I'm trying to figure out. Because if you go to page 4 of what the president put out, which I believe is section 2, paragraph F, it says, develop a plan to increase the capacity of USA jobs to provide applicants, hiring managers, and human resource professionals with information to improve recruitment and hiring process. It sounds like a laudable goal. What I'm trying to get at is, it seems that priority 1 with USA jobs is to streamline, make it work, make it efficient. But what the president put forward here is to increase the capacity. And so it's not working now.
If I could, Mr. Chapes, explain that, because it's not to increase the capacity to grow the size of government. It's to increase what we do right now is there are many jobs that are not advertised on USA Jobs. We call them the accepted service categories. And those are only advertised within government agencies. And people don't know about them, and Americans aren't allowed to compete for them, and veterans don't know about them and are allowed to compete for them. And so what the president is concerned about is he wants to bring all of those jobs which are advertised quietly onto USA Jobs so all American citizens and veterans would know what's out there and they could apply and compete for it.
How many? Give me a sense of the scope of how.
It's 2 million, sir. So I mean the federal
the ones that aren't advertised that probably should be advertised.
Well, the federal employee. Oh, I'll have to get you that number. But in other words, there is no plan, and OPM is not driving to increase USA Jobs to do any massive hiring at this point in time. It's to handle the existing systems that we have in place.
I guess I'm not trying to lay blame at your feet that government is growing at an exceptionally large rate, but most every metric you can look at, that's the reality that you're going to have to deal with. And I'm very sympathetic that you're going to have to hire literally hundreds of thousands of people over the course of time. I'm just trying to get a size of that scope. Help me understand how many people do we have a metric that says how many people are applying per job that's available? I mean, are you dealing with 7 applicants for every available job? I mean, I have no idea what the scope of that is.
We can get you. It really ranges on the position, Mr. Chaffetz, in that some are obviously very popular, and there are some jobs that are so popular we might get as many as 10,000 applications. So
what job's that?
So there are many positions that do draw, because we're also advertising across the entire country.
I'm sure it's not your job.
So with when you advertise across the country, just the level of interest, we are regularly having to screen through thousands of applications per application. So it is a rare job where we're only looking at 7 resumes, for example.
I guess part of what I'd like to get through, and again, it's hard in 5 minutes questioning, is USA Jobs is a critical feature for the functionality in a government that operates from coast to coast and beyond. How that website works, the resources that you need, I think the scope, and again, it's a nuance, but it's important to me, to develop a plan to increase the capacity. It's not just about the capacity. I guess the point I'm trying to make is the efficiency, the effectiveness, the streamlining of it. I support all of those goals, but I would like at some point to have some sort of metric to understand how hard that system's being pushed, because for a lot of people it's just not working. And it sounds like there's a whole lot of jobs out there that the government's hiring, they're not even on there yet.
Right.
And so if you can help me along the way in understanding that, because certainly streamlining this from 160 days to 80 days to hopefully something that's like 30 days would be in everybody's interest. I appreciate the time you yield back. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could,
You could.
just to respond briefly, Ms. Chaffetz, I would be very welcome for both your staff and the chairman's staff to come down. We are trying to overhaul, and we want USA Jobs to be efficient, to meet the standard of the private sector. The reason the President picked 80 days in the memorandum, not only was it half of sort of what we were doing now, we did survey when I was with those Fortune 200 companies, Fortune 500 companies. 80 days is the average standard for Fortune 500 companies. And so, you know, obviously there are positions you can move quicker on, but on average, because some jobs complicated, takes longer.
If you can cut it in half, more power to you.
Gotcha. But we welcome you to come and help us and look at what we're planning to do with USA Jobs. We're very open and transparent about that.
Just to sort of put an exclamation point on what the ranking member is saying, the last set of numbers that we have, I think it was 2007. And in 2007, in the competitive hiring area, where actually veterans get to have their preference counted, of all the people we hired in 2007, 56% were in the competitive area where veterans could apply their preference. But 44% of the jobs, 44% of the hiring was black box. It was outside the open hiring, outside the USA Jobs, outside the purview of the American public, outside the purview of Congress, outside. So 44% of our hiring. So what we'd like to do is get more in the competitive piece, and I think your opening remarks are right on, spot on. But we'd like to see more transparency, and that would also reduce our anxiety about going around the veteran's preference. That's all I have. The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Washington, D.C., Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You opened a line of question that most concerns me. Actually, I was shocked to find how many employees are hired outside of competitive service. I always brag about how federal service is competitive, and I don't think I'm going to brag that way anymore until I see greater signs of that. The ranking member talked about you're going to be hiring thousands and thousands. You bet your bottom dollar, because your workforce disproportionately consists of baby boomers who came into the federal government at a time when government, starting with Jack Kennedy, when these idealistic young people came into the government and spent their entire service here, and yeah, it's time for them to go because they're reaching retirement age. But Mr. Chairman, the figures you named were I found startling. It's as if the federal service believed it could get a little bit pregnant. But you can't. Either you're competitive or you're not competitive. And when you've got such a huge proportion of jobs, I can't even understand how we got that many. And my line of questioning goes to that, because I'm interested not only in what it does to veterans, but frankly what it does to everybody else. The so-called Federal Career Intern Program. What percentage of federal employees are hired in that program?
I'll have to, let me see if I can get you the exact number, Ms. Norton, if I could. Do we have that with us? Or
I'd like that number.
We'll get you that number for the record.
Do all agencies have the authority to hire under the Federal Career Intern Program?
Yes. That's a delegated authority that goes directly to the agency, not
so
through
it's been delegated by you to all the agencies?
Through the law.
Now, how then can you account for the fact that some agencies look like that's how they do hiring, like the Department of Homeland Security, and others look like they still believe they're in the competitive service?
I'm a little bit at a disadvantage, Ms. Norton, because the Federal Career Intern Program is one of the ones that we are now looking at in depth, both at our agency. It is the subject of a lawsuit right now, of which I am a plaintiff in the suit. The President has directed me to fully investigate this program and report back to him within 90 days on my recommendations and thoughts and substance of this program. And so,
Mr. Barry, give me a legitimate reason. Just give me a hypothetical. Why an agency would use the federal career intern program. What would the agency say if it were asked, which apparently it has not been?
It would be used to bring in students or young people into the government.
So how long a tenure? How long a tenure do these career intern? Boy, that's an oxymoron. Career and intern. You know, an intern by definition, I thought, was supposed to be a short-term employee. What is the average term of employment of these career intern employees?
As the program is established, is they're allowed for a 2-year under the internship, and they must meet, if they pass their performance evaluations and are in good standing, they can then be converted into the civil service after that 2 years.
Oh my goodness. And you mean this program has been going on without a watchdog at the OPM seeking to make sure that it does not become a detour after 2 years around the competitive process? There's nobody that's been in charge of looking at this program? You don't have anybody in your office whose job it was to watch this program?
It's been in existence since 2000, Mrs. Norton, and
that's a long time, Mr. Berry.
Yes, ma'am.
That's why when I asked for the figures, obviously I mean for you to submit those figures within 2 weeks to the chairman of this subcommittee so we can have some idea of what we're talking about. I have no idea what the universe, I mean, what kinds of jobs. I am concerned because, for example, I'm on the Homeland Security Committee, and my understanding is that that has been one of the agencies that has used this program more than others. I wonder if they're reciting security. You know who the Homeland Security Committee is? Let's get down. It's really the same agencies they were before. It's really the Coast Guard and the Border Control, and they're really doing 99.9% of the same civilian mission and function they were doing all along. And I just need to know why some agencies, it looks like it's not a lot of agencies, would be hiring in this way, others would not be. I just have no fix on how one agency would be so much out in front of others. And anything you can tell me about them, since my time is up, I would most appreciate.
I could just perhaps illuminate a little bit. The career internship program in 2003 had about 400 participants back in 2003. Today it has almost 28,000. So we've seen it just in the past few years.
So that's more than half of your 44,000 non-career employees then?
Well, it's a different time frame though, because I'm going from 2003 to today. It went, you know, so, and that's how many are in the, it might be a multi-year internship, so I really can't measure, but I do know that the total participation rate went from 400 to 28,000, so that, it just sends some red flags to me. But another one of our members who has been very energetic and very much engaged in the plight of federal workers, and also has offered his own legislation regarding the way student internships are handled, is Mr. Connolly of Virginia, and I now recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Might I have the indulgence to
Absolutely.
go through my opening statement?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry I'm late.
I understand you're in a competing committee, so you're now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
I thank the Chair. And I welcome John Berry and thank him again for his leadership. The federal government faces a daunting challenge to recruit and retain public service employees, with 48% of the federal workforce eligible for retirement sometime over the next 10 years or so, and projections of 350,000 federal employees retiring as early as 2016, we must expand our capacity to recruit and retain highly skilled federal employees to fill crucial positions in federal agencies. President Obama and Director Berry have taken aggressive action to reduce delays associated with federal hiring by eliminating anachronistic applicant essay requirements and pressing agencies to expedite hiring. Chairman Towns and Chairman Lynch have provided visionary leadership on this committee by advancing the Federal Retirement Reform Act, the Telework Improvements Act, the Paid Parental Leave Act, and the Domestic Partnership Benefits and Obligations Act, all of which I believe will help in facilitating that goal. Building on these achievements, I introduced the Federal Internship Improvement Act, H.R. 3264, with our colleague Congressman Bill Bray of California. As the chairman just mentioned, this legislation is a logical complement to our committee's comprehensive effort to improve federal recruitment and retention. I greatly appreciate the collaboration of the Partnership for Public Service, the National Treasury Employees Union, the National Association of Schools of Public Affairs and Administration in developing and promoting this legislation. In light of the President's executive order directing OPM to study the Federal Career Internship Program, I intend, when we mark up this bill, to introduce an amendment in the nature of a substitute to strike the non-competitive hire portion of our intern bill. This will ensure our effort focuses on strengthening student internship programs consistent with OPM hiring reforms. Most federal agencies have intern programs that lag far behind the private sector in conversion of qualified interns to full-time employees. In 2007, for example, only 3,939 of 59,510 student interns became full-time federal employees, a dismal 6.6% conversion rate. By comparison, in the private sector, employers converted 50.5% of their interns to full-time positions in 2007. Congressman Bill Bray and I worked with the Partnership for Public Service and other public service-oriented organizations to develop the Federal Internship Improvement Act to strengthen these programs. This bill requires federal agencies to report on best practices, such as whether they conduct exit interviews and implement effective intern mentorship programs, whether they rotate people around the agency so they get the full panoply of the mission. To improve recruitment of interns into full-time positions, we must have a better understanding of best practices that could be implemented across all federal agencies with some uniformity, which is desperately lacking right now in the federal workplace. This committee has made great progress, Mr. Chairman, in ensuring that the federal government can recruit and retain employees in the National Capital Region's highly competitive labor market. I applaud you and Chairman Towns for your leadership in these issues and ask that we mark up the Federal Internship Improvement Act at the earliest possible date, and I thank the Chair for my time. If I may now ask just 3 questions of Director Berry. Director Berry, why do you think federal internship programs have such a low conversion rate compared to the private sector?
Well, Mr. Connolly, first let me thank you and Mr. Bilbray and all the members of the committee for your concern and attention on this issue. We welcome the energy that you have brought to this, and one of the things I'm very pleased to cite in the President's memorandum is not only has he asked me to review the Federal Career Internship Program, but to propose a framework for providing effective pathways into the federal government for college students and recent college graduates. And so we very much look forward to working with you and the members of the committee on both sides of the aisle over the next 90 days to see if we can help craft proposals that will allow people to have clean pathways to enter the federal government that will be understandable to students. Right now, what we face is a very confusing panoply of options that more often than not they just walk away from. The conversion rate is very poor. We are looking forward to increasing that substantially. Obviously, if after we've made this training commitment, we've provided, the people have performed well, that's a great pool to draw on for federal service. And so we need to look at all of those options and do what we can to improve those numbers. There's so many reasons to tell you why they're low now, but I think your legislation proposes a lot of great suggestions that we need to incorporate, and we'll look forward to working with you and hopefully expanding this as we develop our report back to the President by August.
Thank you. And just one more question, if I may, Mr. Berry. Are there private sector best practices you think we could benefit from in that review, and are you going to be looking at those best practices as part of the overall comprehensive look at these student internship programs?
Absolutely. Congressman, last fall, Dean Elwood from the Harvard Kennedy School convened for us a wonderful sort of thought conference, and we're looking at actually reconvening that now because it was so helpful. Actually, much of what you see in the hiring reform not only came out of the legislative ideas from this committee, but from that great exchange of ideas. And what that was we brought together leaders from the private sector, leaders from the nonprofit world, leaders from our labor communities, who came together and really helped us wrestle with a number of these topics. And one of the things they expressed was concern for, we need to do a better job of both having clean, clear pathways for students to join the federal workforce and to convert if they're doing great work. At the same time, we need to make sure that we are honoring our merit principles, that we're honoring our veterans' preference, so whatever we do, we have to design with those two hallmarks in mind. But I think we can do it, and I look forward to working with you on developing a proposal that we can all get behind and be very proud of.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I have several letters of support for this legislation. With your consent and that of the committees, I'd ask that they be entered into the record.
Okay, the gentleman, Chair asks unanimous consent that the gentleman's letters of interest be entered into the record. Hearing no objection, so ordered.
And I thank the Chair for his indulgence and that of my colleagues.
Our pleasure. Let me just back up a little bit. Director, you're taking some hostile fire here. I do want to just point out for the record